Hello, beautiful best friends. Welcome and thank you so much for finding your way back to our safe, cozy little space of the internet. It is so lovely to see you and I hope you are having a fantastic week. If you are new here, then hi, my name is Liz and I am so happy that you randomly stumbled across this video. Now is the part where I will warn you that we are not alone today. We are joined by our talented, lovely, amazing guest star, Lily. Do you already want to come say hi? Oh, you do. So we're joined by Lily today. So you might hear her in the background, but she also gives us amazing emotional support breaks when things get too intense. So, you know, you win some, you lose some. And you know everyone came here to see you, not me. So I hope that this video finds you all super well. Me and Lily personally have been panting and sweating our way through this month. February is always the hottest month here in Australia and we do not handle the heat very well. So if I look like I've got a little bit of an extra glow going on today, let's just pretend I overdid it on the highlighter. Speaking of Australia, today we are talking about an Australian case and it's going to be a lot. This is a case that has remained unsolved for 35 years, and I will be 110% honest and say it first caught my attention because of all of the controversy and crazy details surrounding it. But the more I got involved and the more I learned, the more it became just a really, really sad case to me that still has so many unanswered questions. And also, the whole thing absolutely reeks of a cover-up, which makes me really mad. And I feel like by the time we're done here today, a lot of you guys are going to feel the same way. I will warn you guys from the beginning that this case involves a whole lot of moving parts and people and events and theories. Like there might be points where things start to feel a little bit hectic and confusing. And I also imagine there'll be parts in this video where I will start to look a little bit like that unhinged Charlie Day meme. So that's something for us all to look forward to. But trust me, stick with me because it will definitely be worth it in the end. This is one of those cases that is going to stick with you and have you asking questions long after we're done here. But we've got a lot to get through, so let's begin on the morning of Tuesday, the 23rd of September, 1986 on Phillip Island in Victoria. Police had been called out that morning to the home of a young woman named Beth Barnard, and the scene that greeted the officers there would be one that they would later describe as the most horrific they had ever seen. Beth Barnard lay dead on the floor of her bedroom, surrounded by a pool of congealed blood. There was a floral blanket pulled up over her, covering her entire body all the way up to her nose, and on the ground beside her lay a bloody kitchen knife. It was clear that Beth had died as the result of a savage attack, but it was only when the blanket covering her body was pulled down that investigators realized the true extent of her wound. She had been stabbed multiple times in the face, throat, and chest, and her throat had also been slashed down to the bone. One knife wound across her mouth had been dealt with such force that it had knocked out one of her front teeth, but under the blanket, her nightshirt was pulled up to reveal her most horrific injury, a large letter A that had been very intentionally carved into her chest and stomach. So this was clearly no random attack. This had been a frenzied crime of passion, and there wasn't a whole lot of mystery or questions asked about what the meaning was behind this letter A that the killer had left behind. I would imagine that most of you are familiar with or have at least heard of the book The Scarlet Letter, written in 1850 about a young woman in Puritan Boston who gives birth to a baby out of wedlock and is then forced to wear a scarlet letter A on her chest for the rest of her life as a signal to the rest of her community that she was an adulteress. This book was later adapted to a film starring Demi Moore in 1995 and also again loosely in the 2010 film Easy A starring Emma Stone. But back to this murder scene in 1986, the intent of Beth's killer was abundantly clear. The A had been left as a gruesome symbol to mark Beth as an adulteress, and the general assumption was that whatever Beth's infidelities may have been, they had most likely been the driving motive behind her murder. But Beth was just 23 years old. She had no known enemies on the island, and she was a happy, well-liked member of the community. So who could have possibly done this to her? Surprisingly, it didn't take all that long for police to come up with their prime suspect. But before we go any further, we are going to wind it back and learn a little bit more about Beth. Elizabeth Catherine Barnard, better known to her loved ones as Beth, was born in Melbourne, Victoria on Christmas Day 1962 to her parents, John and Margaret. Beth was one of 5 children, and she was described by those who knew her as bubbly, outgoing, full of life and energy, and someone that was just really fun to be around. And this shows in the way that she quickly made friends and fit into the community of Phillip Island when she moved into her family's holiday home there, because this was a community that was said to be very, very close-knit and somewhat closed off, or at least it would have felt that way to any outsiders. Phillip Island itself is a popular holiday spot in Victoria, Australia, sitting about 125 kilometres southeast of Melbourne. The island is about 26 kilometres long and 9 kilometres wide, and it's best known for being home to the Phillip Island Grand Prix circuit, and the motorbike and supercar racing events that take place there are a huge draw card for racing enthusiasts, tourists from all over the world. Can you tell I don't know a lot about racing because I don't know a lot about racing, but apparently it's very popular. And although yes, Phillip Island is an island, it's by no means isolated. It's easily accessible by car because it's connected to the mainland by the San Remo Bridge. And these days, Phillip Island has a population of about 12,000 people, but back when a young 20-year-old Beth moved there in the early 80s, it had a teensy tiny population of about 4,000 residents. In 1984, Beth took a job as a ranger at the Penguin Parade, and FYI, if you're wondering, the Penguin Parade is just as adorable as it sounds. Phillip Island just happens to be home to the largest little penguin colony in the entire world, about 32,000 of them to be exact. And these guys are also known as fairy penguins because they're just so tiny. And every night at dusk, tourists from all over the world gather to watch these little penguins waddle back in from the ocean to return to their burrows and greet their chicks and their neighbors, like just heart smushingly adorable. And it was while a 21-year-old Beth was working at the Penguin Parade that she met a 36-year-old man named Fergus Cameron. And the thing to know about Fergus Cameron was that his family was and still is to this day a very big deal on Phillip Island. Like, if Phillip Island had a royal family, it would be the Camerons. The family had lived on the island for 70 plus years by the time Beth and Fergus met, and they actually owned a large amount of the land there, including the land that the Grand Prix circuit sat on. On top of that, Fergus's brother Don Cameron was also a part of the Shire Council, so we're talking just a super prominent and influential family on the island. 4 months after Beth and Fergus met, working together at the Penguin Parade, Beth actually started working on Fergus's farm as a farmhand, something that she would have been drawn to naturally. She had a bachelor's degree in agricultural science. She loved working outside and working with animals, and she had also gotten really close with the Cameron family themselves. Beth got along really well with Fergus's sister, Pamela Cameron, to the point where Pamela's kids all treated Beth as though she was an honorary sibling. And Beth was also really close with Fergus's brother, Don Cameron, the Shire councillor, who she would call Uncle Donald or Grandpa. So basically, everything between Beth and the Camerons was really cozy, and they were all really friendly with each other. But by May 1985, Beth and Fergus themselves had grown especially close, being around each other all the time, working together at the Penguin Parade, working on the farm together, and they had officially stepped beyond the boundaries of friendship and begun a romantic, intimate relationship, which would have already been controversial enough with Beth being so young and Fergus coming from such a prominent family. But what made their relationship especially gossip-worthy was that Fergus was a married man with a wife and 2 young sons. Regardless, Fergus and Beth's relationship would continue for about 16 months, right up until the night that she was murdered. But in a dramatic twist that no one would see coming, Fergus's wife, Vivienne Cameron, would disappear into thin air the very same night, never to be heard or seen from again. Fergus would later tell the police that while Vivian had clearly been harboring suspicions for months about his fidelity, the two of them had gotten into a massive fight that night where Vivian had finally confronted him about his affair with Beth, and he had confessed to everything. Vivian's abandoned car would be found the following day parked close by to the San Remo Bridge. And I mean, with the whole Scarlet Letter thing, I'm sure you can see where all of this is headed. Basically, the police believed that Vivienne Cameron, a scorned woman filled with fury and jealousy at her husband's affair, had killed his lover, Beth Barnard, in a frenzied rage, and then, overcome with either remorse or dread at what would become of her, she then drove to the San Remo Bridge, where she climbed the railing and jumped into the water below, ending her own life. And there was plenty of evidence found during the 12-month investigation into Beth's murder that backs this theory up. There were cigarette butts found in ashtrays in the kitchen and bathroom of Beth's house, even though Beth herself wasn't known to be a smoker. Vivian was a smoker though, and the cigarettes that were found just happened to be the brand that she smoked. And while there were no discernible fingerprints found at the crime scene, there was a towel found in Beth's bathroom that was soaked in Vivian's blood, and 2 more drops of Vivian's blood were found on a walkway by the back door, which was believed to be the way that the killer had entered and left the house. More importantly, there was obvious motive, and who else other than Fergus's wife would have carved a letter A into his lover's body? So everything seemed pretty clear-cut, a little sensational maybe, but clean-cut. And 12 months after the murder, a coronial inquiry into Beth's death was held, where the coroner found that Beth had died of knife wounds to her chest and throat, that these wounds had been inflicted by another person, and that Vivienne Cameron had contributed to her death. 11 months later, this same coroner presided over another coronial inquiry, this time into Vivian's death, and his findings were that although Vivian's body had never been found, he was satisfied that she was dead and that she had leapt from the San Remo Bridge into the water below. Case closed, right? Except it's not. In fact, just a little while ago in September 2020, Victoria Police confirmed that they still had cold case homicide detectives looking into Beth's murder, because this murder-suicide theory, while at first it makes perfect sense, the closer you look at it, the more it just does not add up at all. And so now it's time for us to meet Beth's supposed killer, Vivienne Cameron. Hello. You all caught up? Yeah? You ready to meet Vivian? You are molting like crazy. And I am wearing a black shirt. That is not a good combination. Do you think that's funny? Hey? Vivian Janice Candy and Fergus Cameron got married in December 1976, 10 years prior to the murder, and this was when Vivian left her family and everything she had ever known behind in Melbourne to join her new husband on his family's farm in Phillip Island. Once there, it's widely known that Vivian was never really accepted by Fergus's family, the extended Cameron clan. Even though she tried her best to get along with them, she was always just a little bit ignored and a little bit of an outsider. Vivian and Fergus had 2 boys, first Dougaled in 1978 and then Hugh, born in 1981. And despite never really fitting in with the Cameron family, Vivian managed to establish herself as a well-liked and highly regarded member of the community on Phillip Island. People said that she was kind, intelligent, and mostly quiet, but also very funny with a very dry sense of humor. But mostly she was known to be a very devoted mother to her 2 boys. Vivian worked at the Phillip Island Community House, which is like their community centre, and people tell stories about Vivian doing things like just showing up with a casserole and a bottle of wine to be there for someone that she knew was having a hard time. She would find homes for kittens so that they wouldn't be put down, and she was also said to be a very strong advocate for other women on the island. Like, The vibe I get was that Vivian was someone with a huge heart and a huge desire to help those around her. Trying to figure out exactly how much Vivian knew about Fergus and Beth, it all gets a bit muddy because there's just so many different accounts, but the general consensus seems to be that everyone on the island knew about the affair, including Vivian herself. But while both Vivian and Fergus had spoken about the affair with friends and family, they had never had a full-on discussion or confrontation about it with each other. But Fergus suspected that Vivian knew, and she suspected that he knew that she knew. Like, it just sounds horrific. In the months and weeks leading up to the murder, people on the island noticed big changes in Vivian's appearance. She dyed her hair and she had lost a lot of weight. And this led to rumours down the track that Vivian had been gearing up to leave Fergus. But a friend of Vivian's would come forward later and say that when he spoke with her just a week before the murder and congratulated her on her weight loss, Vivian just turned to him really sadly and said, "Yes, I'm trying to save my marriage." Vivian had actually come from a broken home herself. Her father had left her mother for a younger woman when she was 8 years old, and it seems like she was determined to not put her own children through that same trauma. So she had actually been attending marriage counselling on her own because Fergus had refused her repeated requests for him to come and join her. It seems like Fergus, though, had long lost interest in trying to save his marriage with Vivian and was instead totally invested in his relationship with Beth. In fact, he later said that at the time, on the rare occasions that he and Vivian were intimate, he felt guilty because it felt like he was cheating on Beth, because by now the affair had been going on for nearly a year and a half and Fergus was in love with Beth. So now that we're all caught up with who everyone was and what everyone was up to, we are going to break down the events that occurred on the night of Monday the 22nd of September 1986, when Beth Barnard was brutally murdered and Vivienne Cameron vanished into thin air without a trace. So at about 8 p.m. that night, Fergus left work at the Penguin Parade and went to Beth's house to do what he described as a wellness check because Beth was sick at home with a cold. And Fergus says that they kissed that night, but they weren't intimate. He had mainly gone to check and see if she was okay and hang out for a bit. And after an hour at about 9 p.m., he left Beth at her home alive and well, having no idea that this was the last time that anyone would see her alive. From there, Fergus headed to his house, arriving home at about 9:20 p.m., where Vivian sat with his sister Marnie Cairns having a glass of wine. Fergus had no idea that Vivian was super pissed because she had called the Penguin Parade and knew that he finished at 8 p.m. So he should have been home an hour ago. But when Fergus stepped through the door, pretty much that second he got a business call. So he was on the phone for about 20 minutes. And then when he got off the call, he was speaking to Marnie for a while. So this whole time, Vivian is fuming and getting more and more impatient. But when Marnie finally left, Vivian got the chance to let all of that rage out. And according to Fergus, it was pretty bad. Fergus says that as soon as Marnie left, Vivian ripped the cord out of the phone and shouted at him, "Where have you been?" And when he eventually confessed that he had been to see Beth, there was this fight of just apocalyptic proportions that ended with Vivian taking her wine glass and smashing it over Fergus's head. And when he turned away from her, Vivian then used the remains of the broken glass to repeatedly stab Fergus in the back. So Fergus was bleeding everywhere. He had a bad cut on his ear and the wounds to his back were just superficial, but they were still bleeding a lot, a whole lot, to the point where he and Vivian decided that he needed medical attention. So they called Marnie, his sister, to come back with her husband Ian to watch the boys, and then they drove to the hospital on the island, arriving there at about 10:15 p.m. And when Marnie and Ian arrived at the house, they obviously saw the fallout from this huge fight between Vivian and Fergus. There were bloody tissues and clothing and towels in the bathroom, as well as other blood throughout the house. And according to Marnie, they didn't touch any of that, but when it came to the bloody glass, glass on the floor in the kitchen, she didn't want the boys stepping on it when they woke up, so that she did clean up, unknowingly destroying evidence of the domestic dispute between Fergus and Vivian. Meanwhile, at the hospital, we know from reports from the staff working that night that Vivian and Fergus didn't tell them the truth about the fight. In fact, a nurse tending to Fergus got annoyed at them because they were being so damn secretive, and she told them that to treat Fergus's wounds properly, she needed to know how he had gotten them. So after a bit of back and forth, Vivian eventually told her that he had fallen through a glass pane window. Interestingly, this same nurse would say that Vivian and Fergus seemed really close during that visit to the hospital, and Vivian seemed very concerned about Fergus and his injuries. Like, she never would have guessed that they had just been fighting. Instead, she assumed that Fergus must have gotten into a fight with one of his brothers and that he and Vivian were being so hush-hush because it was the frickin' Cameron family and they didn't want to set the gossip mill going. Vivian reportedly even pressed for Fergus to stay overnight at the hospital because she was so concerned for his welfare, but it was decided that his injuries weren't severe enough for that, so they both left and arrived home from the hospital at about 12 a.m., probably just completely both physically and emotionally drained. But they didn't go to sleep. Instead, according to Fergus's statement to police, now that everything had cooled down, he and Vivian had a long talk where they made the decision that they were going to get a divorce. And they also agreed together, as suggested by Vivian, that Fergus was going to get full custody of the boys and they would stay with Fergus on Phillip Island, whereas Vivian would be leaving the very next day to return to Melbourne and live with her family. This was because, according to Fergus, Vivian said that he was an excellent father, whereas she wasn't a very good mother. And Vivian fully accepted that Beth would be his new partner and as a result would be taking over raising her two boys together with Fergus. This discussion ended at about 1 a.m. and Vivian then took Fergus to his sister Marnie's place to spend the night. And as she was leaving, Marnie gave Vivian a couple of sleeping pills in an envelope, and Fergus and Marnie both then stood and watched Vivian pull down the driveway to head back home, again having no idea that this was the last time that anyone would see her alive. But then a couple of hours later, just after 3 a.m., Vivian made a really strange phone call to her friend Robin Dixon, who lived close by. And according to Robin, Vivian told her that there had been trouble, that she was at the hospital, and asked her to come and get the boys and take them home for the night. Even though we know that Vivian and Fergus had left the hospital hours before this. So at about 3:15 a.m., Robin and her husband went and picked up the boys and took them back to their place. They said that there was no sign of Vivian at the house, and it's at this point where Vivian had actively lied about her whereabouts that police say that she was setting up an alibi because she had decided that she was going to go and murder Beth. Now, earlier when driving Fergus to the hospital and then to Marnie's, Vivian had taken her car, her Holden Kingswood, which was the car that she drove every day. But Vivian and Fergus also owned a Toyota Land Cruiser that was mostly used around the farm. And at 3:30 a.m. that night, Beth's neighbor woke to the sounds of a vehicle matching the description of the Cameron's Land Cruiser driving up to Beth's house, the same Land Cruiser that would later be found abandoned by the San Remo Bridge. The next morning, it was 7:30 a.m. and Robin Dixon, Vivian's friend who had come and picked up the boys the night before, needed to get to work, but she still had the boys, and she hadn't been able to get in touch with Vivian by calling the landline at the Cameron house, so Robin ended up calling Fergus's brother, Don, and this was when the alarm was raised that Vivian had gone missing. And Fergus says that he was instantly sick with worry because of everything that had happened the night before, and when he found out that Vivian was missing, his mind immediately went back to when they had pulled up at the hospital and Vivian had turned around and said something along the lines of, "I'm just going to go and get the little bitch." Something that he had brushed off at the time as just something she had said in anger, but now he was worried that Vivian really might have gone and done something terrible to Beth. And so for some reason, rather than anyone from the Cameron family heading out to look for Vivian, Fergus's wife, Fergus instead asked his brother and brother-in-law, Don and Ian, to go and check on his lover, Beth. And of course, when Don and Ian arrived at Beth's house at around 9 a.m, they saw the bloody crime scene and saw Beth's body lying on the bedroom floor, so they immediately drove to the police station to report a murder. But apparently they struggled to actually say this. Instead, after rambling aimlessly for a reported 10 minutes, Don Cameron eventually told the officer that Beth was not well. Meanwhile, Fergus was back at Marnie's house worrying away because Don and Ian never told him that they had found Beth's body. Obviously, this was the 80s, so they didn't have mobile phones, and they had also driven to the police station rather than using the landline at Beth's house to call 000. So I guess Don and Ian had enough common sense between them to not want to mess with the crime scene. So Fergus, still worried about Beth, called his sister Marnie at work to ask her to call Beth. Weird, right? Like, first he asks his brother and his brother-in-law to go and check on Beth rather than just heading over there himself. And now he was calling his sister to ask her to call Beth. Like, if Fergus was so worried, why didn't he just call Beth himself? And also, why was no one worrying about Vivian? Marnie did try to call Beth, but of course she couldn't get through, and she told Fergus this, leaving him to continue worrying. And it was about 9:30 a.m. that the officer arrived on the scene at Beth's house. It was noted that both of Beth's cars were at the house parked in their usual spots. The porch light was on and the back door had been left ajar, even though as a woman living on her own, Beth was known to be relatively security conscious. So the officer, not really sure what to expect, entered the home through the open back door and went down the long corridor to find Beth lying face up on the ground in the bedroom, her head nearly in the doorway. And while she was covered up by that blanket, despite the report from Don Cameron saying that Beth wasn't well, it was immediately clear that she had been dead for hours. It was believed that the attack most likely begun when Beth was lying in bed, potentially asleep. She had then either risen to defend herself or she had been pulled out of bed by her attacker. And Beth had put up one hell of a fight. She had defensive wounds on her fingers, her forearms, and one of her ankles. But it was clear from the lack of disarray in the room that she hadn't stood a chance, and the killer had quickly taken control, stabbing Beth multiple times before slashing her throat. There were blood smears all over Beth's body, like from her face down to her knees, as though once she was dead, her killer had used these circular sweeping motions to wipe their bloody hands off on her body. And there was blood found in the bathroom sink, as though the killer had then made an attempt to clean their hands. But then, rather than being in a rush to flee the scene, there was evidence that the killer had hung around at the house long enough to smoke a cigarette after killing Beth, possibly more. So taking this into account, also the fact that Beth's body had just been left where it had fallen and the kitchen knife had been left out in the open right beside her, it gave investigators this impression that Beth's killer didn't really care whether they were found out or not. It wasn't until much later that day that Fergus and Vivian's Land Cruiser was officially located by the police at about 4 p.m. near a playground about half a kilometre away from the San Remo Bridge, after it was reported by none other than Fergus's sister-in-law, Pamela Cameron. Later, a baker would tell the police that he had seen a car parked in that same spot at about 5 a.m. that morning when he was on his way to his rounds on Phillip Island. He did also say that he couldn't be sure what the colour or model of the car was, so it might have been the Land Cruiser, but it also could have been just some random car. But it was an odd spot for someone to be parked at that time of night. It was Pamela Cameron, though, that spotted and recognised the Land Cruiser on her way home from work that afternoon. And when she pulled over to check it out, she found that the car was unlocked with its windows down and the keys still in the ignition. And inside was Vivian's handbag, 2 packets of cigarettes, a blood-stained face washer, and a carving knife. So Pamela immediately locked it up and called the police. And this was when the police finally started searching for Vivian nearly a whole day after she had gone missing, because apparently the whole police department was made up by just 2 officers and they had been caught up all day investigating Beth's murder. But the police were never really looking for an alive and well Vivian, of course, because their immediate suspicion from the location where the Land Cruiser had been abandoned that Vivian had ended her own life by jumping from the bridge after murdering Beth. So there was an extensive 4-day land and sea search for her body, but these efforts turned up nothing, and the search was eventually called off. And despite Vivian's body never being found, it would be less than 2 years later that a coroner would find that Vivian was dead and that she had been the one that murdered Beth. And this was, for a good long while, the neatly packaged, widely accepted version of events. But like I said, this is still an unsolved case. And the more you look into this version of events, the more things just don't match up. I guess the first thing for us to bear in mind is that in all of the events that we've spoken about that occurred that night, including Fergus's welfare visit to Beth and then his big fight with Vivian, where she attacked him with a wine glass. In all of this, we're missing one big important part of the puzzle. We don't have Beth or Vivian's version of events. And I'm not saying that things didn't happen how Fergus and the rest of the Cameron family says that they happened. I'm just saying that for a lot of it, we only have Fergus's word to go off. A man whose wife and mistress died on the exact same night. A man who, by the way, was allowed 2 whole days to gather himself before he was questioned by police. So let's start off with Fergus's visit to Beth's house that night at 8 p.m, where Fergus claims that he and Beth did not have sex. During Beth's autopsy, there was semen found in and around her genitals, and testing at the time couldn't determine whose semen it was. But Fergus is saying that he and Beth didn't have sex that night. So then how did it get there? Yes, the semen could have gotten there in the days leading up to the murder, but when asked, all of Beth's friends said that they felt that she would have showered every day. Still, if Fergus isn't lying and he and Beth didn't have sex that night, then whose semen was it? Well, Beth had no shortage of admirers on Phillip Island. In fact, when she had arrived, she had made quite the splash and drawn quite a bit of attention from the male population on the island. And it did seem that Beth was only interested in Fergus, so she would knock all of these guys down if they made an advance. But there was one particular guy that proved to be just a little bit hard to deter. This guy would send Beth expensive flowers, and he would visit her home when she wasn't there and then just wait around outside for her. And Beth had recently complained to a friend that he was coming around and mowing her lawn all the time, even though she had repeatedly asked him not to. And apparently she had actually shouted at him about it, and he had gotten quite angry, but he was still pursuing her. It's worth noting that this guy also drove a Land Cruiser, so it would have fit the description of the car that Beth's neighbor heard that night. And he left the island not long after the murder. His name has never been publicly released, but police say that they did question him and he was cleared as a suspect. There's also the fact that one of Beth's neighbors reported seeing another car at her house that night at about 7:50 p.m. And unless they were mistaken about the time, this couldn't have been Fergus because he only finished at the Penguin Parade at 8 p.m. So could Beth have had another romantic visitor that night before Fergus had arrived? This brings us to the theory that Fergus was the killer and that he had murdered Beth in a jealous rage when he found out that she was seeing someone else. Like we said, he was in love with Beth, and according to the argument that he said he had with Vivian that night, he was planning on making their relationship official. But what if he found out that Beth had another lover? Beth had also recently told a friend that while she did love Fergus, she wasn't comfortable with the affair any longer, and she told this friend that she planned on giving Fergus an ultimatum that very night. So what if when Beth delivered this ultimatum, all Fergus could think about was the negative impact that the affair coming out would have on his public image and his personal life, and he had flown into a murderous rage? But Beth didn't die until later that night, right? Yeah, so it turns out we don't actually know what time Beth died that night because the post-mortem pathologist who performed Beth's autopsy was unable to determine her time of death. And so at the coronial inquiry, the coroner ruled that Beth had been murdered at 3:30 a.m., based purely on the fact that authorities believed that Vivian was the killer, and this was the time that Beth's neighbor reported hearing the loud car that pulled up at the house that matched the description of Vivian's Land Cruiser. But what if Beth had actually been murdered before that? It is a pretty big coincidence that the very same night that Beth was murdered and had clearly put up a fight against her killer, Fergus turned up at the hospital needing to be treated for injuries from a domestic dispute. Remember, he and Vivian never said to the hospital staff that Fergus's injuries had been inflicted by Vivian. This version of events only came about 2 days later when police finally questioned Fergus, leaving him plenty of time to cook up a story about how Vivian had attacked him with a wine glass that, by the way, was never found. Like Marnie, Fergus's sister, said that there had been glass on the floor in the kitchen and said that she cleaned it up. But when the police searched the trash, there was never any broken glass found. So if we assume that Fergus had actually gotten his injuries while murdering Beth, is it possible that he came home and confessed to Vivian? And then Vivian, overjoyed that the other woman was out of the picture, agreed to help Fergus cover up the crime. Is that why they seem so lovey-dovey at the hospital? Because they were literally co-conspirators. But then what happened between the hospital visit and the following morning that resulted in Vivian disappearing? The issue with this theory, though, that Fergus sustained his injuries at Beth's house is that none of his blood was ever found there, only Vivian's and Beth's. And this brings us to the blood evidence, and it's going to get a little messy because this is where things really start to not add up. So let's start with Fergus and Vivian's fight and the trip to the hospital. We know that Fergus was the one that was injured at this point and required medical attention for his wounds, and that he had been bleeding all over the place at home. But despite this, when police processed the scene at the Cameron house, the majority of the blood samples were actually found to have come from Vivian, not Fergus. And when Marnie told the police all about how she and Ian had come over to watch the boys while Fergus and Vivian had gone to the hospital and they had seen all of the blood, she specifically mentioned that they had seen a bloody face washer and a bloody towel in the bathroom. But just like the broken wine glass, this face washer and towel were never found by police at the Cameron house. However, if you have a good memory, you might remember me mentioning that there was a bloody face washer found in the abandoned Land Cruiser, and there was a blood-soaked towel found in Beth's bathroom, a towel that was assumed the killer had cleaned their hands with after they had murdered her. But all of the blood found on these items were found to be Vivian's, not Beth's, which makes no sense because, like I said, the killer had wiped their hands all over Beth's body, so their hands should have been covered in her blood. Also, none of Vivian's blood or DNA was found on or around Beth's body. So even though both Beth's blood and Vivian's blood were found at Beth's house, it was all very separate and isolated. Like there was no mingling of the two women's blood happening at all, anywhere. Almost to the point where, I don't know, someone might feel like the scene had been staged. And once you start considering the possibility that the scene was staged, all of the evidence placing Vivian there starts to seem very plantable. The cigarette butts, the towel soaked in her blood, the blood drops found by the back door and yet nowhere else in the house, even the A that had been left on Beth's chest. All of these things pointing such a big, obvious finger towards Vivian being the killer, but was it all too obvious? There was none of Beth's blood found in the abandoned Land Cruiser, even though if Vivian had been the killer, she should have been absolutely covered head to toe in Beth's blood when she got back in there to drive to the bridge. Or even if she had cleaned herself up a little bit, you would have still expected to have found some of Beth's blood in trace amounts. A place where Beth's blood was found that once again throws that whole 3:30 a.m. time of death into question was Fergus and Vivian's house hours before the murder was supposed to have taken place. So when Marnie was telling police all about the blood in the house from the fight, she specifically mentioned that there had been a piece of paper with blood on it on the bed in the spare bedroom, a place where Fergus admitted that he had sat down to cool off after the blow-up with Vivian, but the blood on the paper wasn't Fergus's. It was Beth's. But if Marnie and Ian had seen this piece of paper at about 10 p.m., 5 hours before Beth was supposed to have been murdered, how did it have her blood on it? So I already know that you guys are super clever, and I feel like you've probably already noticed by now that I don't personally believe that Vivian was Beth's killer, or at least I feel like there's a huge amount of space for reasonable doubt, like an Olympic swimming pool size of space. But there are people that disagree, that fully believe that the police and the coroner are right and that Vivian was the killer. And I mean, fair call. Vivian was the only one that definitely had ample motive, right? So let's for a moment go back to that night and assume that Vivian was the killer, okay? Vivian has murdered Beth, and now filled with rage or remorse or fear, she's made the decision that she is going to end her own life. The problem is that it makes exactly zero sense that she would choose to do this by jumping from the San Remo Bridge. This bridge, people jump off it as a dare. It is not a tall bridge. In fact, it's believed that no one has successfully ever suicided by jumping from that bridge. You might get injured if you have a bad fall, but it's just not a jump that will kill you, especially in the early hours of the morning. That is the time that Vivian is said to have taken her deathly plunge, because it's high tide, making the fall even shorter. What would have made perfect sense was for Vivian to have jumped or even just driven the Land Cruiser off the cliffs that their property backed onto. Like, they're literally right there. But if Vivian did drive to the bridge, why would she park half a kilometre away? Why not just drive right up onto the bridge itself? What makes even less sense is the fact that Vivian's handbag was found in the Land Cruiser, because this handbag was spotted in the kitchen at Vivian's house at 3 a.m. by Robin Dixon when she and her husband came to pick up the boys, the time that Vivian was supposed to be on her way to murder Beth. So this means that Vivian had left the bag at her house, gone to murder Beth, and then driven back to her house just to collect the bag and then drive back past Beth's house to the San Remo Bridge. You know, unless someone else put the bag in the Land Cruiser at some point before it was found by police at 4 p.m. Experts believe that if Vivian had jumped from the bridge that night, that something would have been washed ashore, be it her body, her clothing, her possessions, but nothing has ever been found. One of the local detectives also walked the bridge after the Land Cruiser was found that day and found no disturbances in the salt crust that covered the railings, something you would have expected to find if someone had in fact climbed over it the night before. And it's details like these that have sparked rumors over the years that Vivian is still alive out there somewhere, that she murdered Beth and then staged her own suicide. But this would mean that she had intentionally left behind her two boys, who she loved more than anything. You know, the one thing that everyone who knew Vivian says about her is just how devoted she was to her sons, and they find it impossible to believe that she would have voluntarily left them behind. There is also one huge witness account that we haven't spoken about yet, and what she has to say throws even more chaos into the timeline, which is probably why this witness was completely ignored at the coronial inquiries into both Beth and Vivian's deaths. So Glenda Frost, who was a friend of Vivian's, claims that she received a phone call from Vivian the morning after Beth was murdered at 10 a.m., 6 hours after Vivian was supposed to have jumped to her death. But because news hadn't broken on the island yet, Glenda had no idea when Vivian called that she had been reported reported as missing and that Beth had been murdered. And according to Glenda, during this phone call, Vivian acted completely normally. She was talking about getting a gift for one of the women that was leaving the community house. She was asking about sewing patterns, like literally the most mundane things you could talk about. Definitely not the kind of things you would even be capable of thinking about if you had brutally murdered your husband's mistress and then staged your own death just hours prior. So Glenda believes from this phone call that just like herself, Vivian had no idea at this point that Beth had been murdered. And she also believes that she's not even the last person to speak with Vivian that day because she could hear voices in the background during the phone call. And Glenda, when she heard these voices, asked Vivian, "Oh, are the boys home?" And we know that that couldn't have been the case because by this point, one of the boys was in school and the other was with the Cameron family. But instead of just saying who she was really with, Vivian didn't really respond to the question at all. She just continued talking normally for a short while, and then the phone call ended not much later. Later that day, when Glenda did find out about everything, she, of course, reported the phone call to the police, but they never really took Glenda seriously. Like, they didn't accuse her of lying. They agreed that Glenda did have this phone conversation with Vivian, but that she must have just gotten confused about what day it had taken place. Even though Glenda had a friend with her at the time that heard the entire conversation and backed her up that it had definitely been that day. And on one hand, I get it, because even if Vivian hadn't killed Beth, she still had a lot on her plate, with the huge fight with Fergus the night before, and then the hospital trip and her marriage on the rocks. It just seems so strange that she would have been able to have a casual conversation with a friend about gifts and sewing patterns. But on the other hand, I feel like this phone call took place literally hours before Glenda found out with the rest of the island that Beth Barnard had been murdered and Vivienne Cameron had vanished. Surely it would be pretty damn hard for her to be confused whether the call had taken place that day or not. And in 35 years, Glenda has never once changed her story. But even if the coroner disregarded this account from Glenda, which clearly he did, how did he make the ruling that Vivian had died by jumping from the bridge that morning at 4 a.m. when there's exactly zero evidence that proves this was the case? And why would he make this ruling less than 2 years after Vivian had vanished, when usually it takes an average of about 7 years to have a missing person legally declared dead? He could have just recorded an open verdict and said that he didn't know what had become of Vivian. Was he under pressure from the authorities, from the Camerons? We don't know. There has, of course, been a lot of rumors surrounding this case over the last 35 years. For instance, not long after the murder, there was a rumor that it had actually been a V carved into Beth's chest, as in V for Vivian. But of course, a lot of the rumors center on Fergus himself and his potential involvement. There's even a rumor that Fergus murdered Vivian and that her body was never found because he buried her under the Grand Prix track. And it's true that Fergus did have a lot to lose if he and Vivian got divorced. Vivian would have gotten half of everything and potentially full custody of the kids, because remember, we only have Fergus's word that Vivian was going to leave them with him, which you gotta admit sounds like a very odd decision for such a devoted mother. Vivian had been telling people for weeks that she might be leaving Fergus, but always said that if she did, she would take those boys with her. And there's just no way that she would have agreed to leave them with Fergus and Beth and just casually up and left to Melbourne to start a new life. There have been some updates in the case over the years. In 1995, when DNA testing became available, the evidence from the crime scene was re-examined, and it was found that the blood on the kitchen knife beside Beth's body was Vivian's, and it was also Vivian's DNA found on the cigarette butts at the scene. And police said that this evidence now conclusively placed Vivian at the scene and proved that she was the killer, confirming their original findings and clearing Fergus of any blame. But did it though? Because the scientist who completed the testing on the knife said that he was never for certain that it was the murder weapon itself, because he couldn't see how this straight kitchen knife could have created the irregular pattern of cuts in the fabric of Beth's nightshirt. And a knife expert agreed with him, saying that the cuts in Beth's nightshirt were more likely caused by a knife that was popular in the mid-80s but has since been banned. And this knife had two prongs at the base of the handle that would have lined up perfectly with the tears in the fabric. There was never a knife found like this at the crime scene though. So the kitchen knife that was found by Beth's body, was it planted there? And if it had Vivian's blood on it, was it possible that it had been used to attack Vivian and was then placed at the crime scene to frame her for Beth's murder? And there's still so many unanswered questions as well. For instance, why did Vivian lie to Robin Dixon on that 3 a.m. phone call and tell her that she was still at the hospital when we knew that she had left there hours ago? And where did she really go at 3 a.m.? Who was the intended victim that night? If Beth had been the intended victim and had been killed by a jilted lover or admirer, then how does Vivian's disappearance play into that? And if Vivian was the intended victim, then is it really plausible that Beth was murdered as well, just to frame Vivian and create this murder-suicide scenario as a cover? Or is it possible that someone felt that both Vivian and Beth were causing too much trouble and needed to be taken out of the picture, and decided that framing one for the murder of the other would be the perfect way to kill two birds with one stone? If Vivian had ended her own life by jumping off the bridge that night, then why did she go home and get her handbag first? Why did she park half a kilometer away and then carry on foot? Why would she leave her cigarettes in the car at what would have been such an incredibly stressful time? And why was there never any evidence found that she had jumped off that bridge at all? Is it possible that if Vivian was the killer, that she confessed to Fergus that night and he was the one that helped her cover up the crime, and then together they staged her death so that she could disappear? Why did Fergus send his brother and brother-in-law to Beth's house that morning instead of just going over there himself? Was he trying to keep a low profile after his fight with Vivian the night before? Or did he already know at that point that Beth was dead, but didn't want to be the one that discovered the body? If Glenda Frost is right about that phone call from Vivian, then who was with Vivian at 10 a.m. that morning, hours after she was supposed to have died? And why have they never come forward in all of these years? I mean, there's just so many questions. Fergus Cameron remarried in 1993 and still lives on Phillip Island to this day. In fact, he's the deputy chair of the tourism board there. And the Cameron family sold the Grand Prix land in 2004 for $20 million, an amount that Vivian would have been eligible for 1/6 of had she still been alive. If you want to do an even deeper dive on this case, because believe it or not, even with all we've spoken about, there is still more. There is a 10-part podcast called The Vanishing of Vivienne Cameron by case file and true crime author Vicky Petratus, who quite literally wrote the book on this case, The Phillip Island Murder. Vicky, in my opinion, is the closest thing to the leading expert on this case, and when her book came out, it was reportedly banned on Phillip Island. Like, the bookshop there just refused to sell it. But the podcast is fantastic. It's extremely detailed and will just leave you with even more questions. So if you're interested, there will be a link in the description below. Like we said, according to Victoria Police, this case is still open and under investigation. And as of 2012, there is still a warrant out for Vivian's arrest because, I mean, her body was never found and technically she is still a missing person. In 2001, the DNA was retested again, but police never revealed exactly what items were tested, what the results were from the testing, or if there have been any developments in the case. So we still don't know whose semen was found during Beth's autopsy. Also, there were reportedly fingernail scrapings taken from Beth, but we don't know if any DNA was found there. We just don't know. As usual, though, I would love to hear how you guys feel about this case. Probably even more so than I usually would. Like, even if you're not one to regularly comment, this is the case that I want to hear your thoughts on, because I feel like I have fallen down a rabbit hole and I need to talk about it with you all ASAP. Do you agree that the evidence against Vivian doesn't quite fit? Do you think she's potentially still alive out there somewhere? If you feel like it wasn't Vivian that killed Beth, then who do you think did? Or do you feel like I'm just going crazy and all of this did really happen how authorities says it happened? This hangout does not have to end here. We can just meet up in the comments below and talk it all out. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, you can let me know by giving it a big thumbs up. And if you are still watching and not already subscribed, then I would love if you did that so that you and me can be best friends forever and ever and make this a regular thing. No pressure. You come to say bye? It's so hot, isn't it? I know. Are you just melting? You look like you're melting. We do not handle the heat well, do we? Okay. Thank you so much for spending this time with me and Lily. We hope you have a week just as fabulous as you are, and we will be counting down the hours until we see you in the next one. Bye.